Hi, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff. Welcome back to Economics Matters, the podcast. Um, I thought I would do something a little different in this podcast. I thought I would just spend some time talking about an economic issue, basically give you an economic seminar. And I'm just back with my wife from a quick vacation to over spring break to Iceland, and we visited their main museum in Reykjavik, and one of the exhibits is about how the glaciers in Iceland are melting, and they show this kind of time lapse photography of the decline in the glaciers. Oh, by the way, our cat Riley, is here to co-present, so you get to see him. He might be talking a little bit, but anyway, we know from lots of prominent scientists that uh, climate change isn't in the future, and it's not around the corner. It's really here. It's here right now, and that there are major dangers associated with it, including uh, the Gulf Stream changing direction and producing an ice age in Europe, uh, the parts of the Antarctic ice shelf melting and causing a 15-foot rise in sea levels. That would take out about a third of the population of the US, centered around the coasts, unless they moved. So, uh, and not to mention Bangladesh and good parts of the rest of the world would be suffering enormous damages from this. So, I want to talk to you today about climate uh, economics, climate change, and I'm going to tell you some things that you probably uh, aren't expecting to hear. So, my commentary today, my seminar's title, if you like, is How Economists Started and Can Stop Their Climate War. That's a pretty strong statement in a title. It says that economists have started a climate war and that they have the ability to stop it if they start talking about economics, climate economics properly, to start doing that properly. So I'm going to talk to you about how to think about climate economics and how I and my co-authors have been working, what we've been coming up with by working on this problem for the last 5 or 6 years. So let's start back about 50 years when climate economics was first developed by its founder or uh, person who first thought that this was an issue, a concern, William Nordhaus, at Yale. He received the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on climate economics. And a small army of climate economists that followed in Bill's footsteps in modeling climate change and how to fix it. Now, uh, I've known Bill a long time. I have enormous respect for him. I was one of the many thousands of economists who nominated him for the Nobel Prize. I think putting your finger on the world's largest negative externality uh, at far before anybody else was thinking about it is an enormous contribution. What I have concerns with is the way that uh, not the way that Bill did his initial modeling, but the fact that economists have kind of continued in his footsteps in terms of their modeling, and in the process have produced what I view as a climate war. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the results of Bill's analysis and subsequent analyses that are using the same methodology has resulted in the young and the old being at odds. We have Greta Thunberg from Sweden coming to the UN and basically, shouting, screaming, yelling at the older delegates that you uh, people are doing this to us, and that unless you uh, prevent climate change, we will never forgive you. Uh, so that to me is, some indication uh, that the kind of foremost spokesperson of the younger generation uh, is coming and saying to the older generation, you folks are, you know, jerks, or she has probably stronger expressions for older people, and that you should understand what you're doing to us and to future generations. Uh, so it wasn't a conversation that was very pleasant. It wasn't one that led to anything. It wasn't Greta suggesting that there was a solution uh, that she could provide to get everybody on the same page. So it really wasn't kind of an economic discussion as I would have presented it to the delegation there, to the representatives, had I had the opportunity, because there are win-win solutions here to this problem. It doesn't have to be the young versus the old, and it doesn't have to be climate endangered countries against climate producing countries. So we have both an intergenerational climate war and we have a regional climate war. Uh, with some regions in some countries uh, arguing that they're being, uh, injured or damaged, and that the countries doing the damage should be compensating them. So let me explain how we got into this boat where we have this terrible problem, and we've got economists who I think have kind of created a way of thinking about this problem that is leading to people uh, concluding that it's us versus uh, me versus you, us versus them, that there's no way in which everyone can actually benefit from fixing this problem. And that's really the opposite of what economics teaches us. The economics of externalities goes back to really 100 years ago, to work by people like uh, Vilfredo Pareto, who's a famous economist at the University of Lausanne. And he and other economists taught us about how to think about externalities and how to fix them. And he also stressed, and subsequent work stresses, that when you have negative externalities, you have to look for who's causing them, and realize that they're being caused out of self-interest, that they're not being caused by accident. So Nordhaus comes along in the early 70s at Yale University and posits uh, recognizes, to his great credit, that there is this problem, and then he posits a world in which there's what he calls a social planner. Basically, it's an economic god who he conjures up, and this god has preferences about how he views current generations and generations coming in the short term, generations coming in the medium term, generations coming in the long term. He has concern for all these generations, but and that concern is kind of determined by, or regulated by, what's called a time preference factor. And in Nordhaus's framework model, and it's all written down in mathematics, and then you put in kind of values for the coefficients in the math, and then you get the model to simulate. You compute it on a computer, and then you see what it tells you. So in his framework, you had this social planner, this economics god, come and decide, hey, if we produce more carbon, I control everything, but if we produce more carbon emissions, that's going to impact negatively future generations. I care about them. I also care about current generations. Therefore, here's the optimal carbon tax, global carbon tax, that we should all adopt. And it's one that is going to maximize that being the social planner's preferences, make the social planner as well off as possible. Now, the problem with that is that other economists came along and said, well, we have a different social planner in mind. We have a social planner in mind that actually cares more about future generations relative to current generations than Nordhaus's social planner. So immediately we have another god on the scene, actually more gods than just two. A whole series of economists who I think should have known better started writing articles about what the right social planner's time preference rate should be. What's the right degree of concern about current versus future generations? And this quickly devolves into religion. It's substituting religion for economics, in effect, because there's no end to that kind of discussion. I can, choose this social planner. You can choose your social planner. Joe over there can choose his. Sally can choose hers. And what we end up with is no answer. We end up with a religious answer. If I believe in this particular God, or if I believe in, and a God here stands for this degree of morality about how we should treat current versus future generations, well, then we get that answer. If we believe in this degree of morality, we get a different answer and a very different carbon tax path, not only the initial level of the carbon tax, but also the path. And when I say carbon tax today, I want to refer to not just mitigating carbon emissions via explicit carbon taxation, putting on a tax on emissions, but there's also other types of policies that are effectively carbon taxes, but aren't exactly called carbon taxes. So you can have cap and trade, different kinds of trading mechanisms, for example, that would limit carbon emissions to the same degree that you could do with an explicit carbon tax. So anyway, you have this religious war going on, and then you had some other economists coming along and saying, well, let's abandon the social planner, but let's assume that there are different, in effect, tribes that are going to be, there are different tribes inhabiting the world, and those tribes care just about themselves and their descendants. They're the current members and their future descendants. And the reason that we have a carbon problem is that these tribes can't coordinate their behavior, and they're trying to free ride on each other. So this tribe over here uses more fossil fuels, burns more coal and gas and oil because they don't take into account, they don't care about the other tribes. Now, the problem with that is that if you care about people in your own tribe, then you're generationally altruistic. I care about my son, and my son cares about my daughter, and they care about their kids, and their kids care about their kids. So therefore, I'm through my children and through my children's children and great grandchildren, I care in effect about everybody in my tribe through the end of time. And then the other, tribes do the same, or tribal leaders, if you like, or dynastic leaders. But then when you start thinking about members of your tribe marrying, starting to have feelings and love for altruism for other tribal members, then you find in this mathematical framework that I start caring about these other tribes, even though they're not blood relatives of mine. They become economic relatives, if you like. And then the whole thing just devolves into everybody caring about everybody, and it's in effect back to the social planner framework. There's also absolutely no evidence that at least in the US, and I don't see any strong evidence in other places that I've heard of, that current generations care all that much about uh, future generations, that even uh, people that are older care that much about people that are younger. Uh, and and it really goes, I can go a little bit further and say that if you look at uh, members of a extended family, if you look at, for example, adult parents and their adult kids, and you ask, do they really care about their kids? Are they really economically in love with their kids? Um, well, the answer seems to be no. And what do I mean by economic love? What I mean is kind of putting your money where your mouth is. If your economic love means that if I learn that my child has, lost, let's say, $50,000 and I've gained $50,000, maybe uh, let's say that's the experiment. The government takes $50,000 uh, from my son and gives it to me, maybe through the tax system. And I don't really realize that the government has directly, the government has taken this money from my son Joe and given it to me. Uh, but I do know that Joe's lost $50,000 and then I've gained $50,000. Well, economic altruism would say that I should take my $50,000 that I've just received and hand it to Joe, and that our relative consumption levels, our relative living standards should be dependent. It should not depend on who's got the money. So if Joe has more money and I have less money, or I have more money and he has less money, we should still, the ratio of our spending should be the same. I should give him, I will just, if I've got relatively more, I'll give him, make bigger transfers to him. If he's got relatively more, he'll make bigger transfers to me. It doesn't mean that our two levels of consumption will be equal, exactly equal, but that the ratio will be independent of who's got the money. Okay, that's the sharing that comes out, implication of economic love. And you just don't see that in the data. And you don't, I did a series of studies with other economists, uh, two in particular, Joe Altanji, who's an economist at Yale, and Fumio Hayashi, who's an economist at the University of Tokyo. And we showed in three pretty prominent papers that there's just absolutely no evidence of altruism within the extended family. And then I worked with Andy Abel, who's a professor at Wharton School at Penn at the University of Pennsylvania, showing that there's no evidence that cohorts are kind of sharing resources in the manner that altruism would suggest, or that a social planner would effect if there was a God running things, uh, uh, or that if we had dynasties, how dynasties would behave. We don't see that kind of behavior. So in a whole series of papers with a variety of co-authors with a variety of data sets, it became pretty clear to me and my co-authors that there's just no basis for this basic assumption of altruism, which Bill Nordhaus is invoking via the assumption of an economic God, and that subsequent economists have invoked in the form of these dynasties. That's called the single agent model. I'm the head of a dynasty. I'm like one agent in charge of everybody coming from here through eternity who is a blood relative. But again, that whole thing doesn't really work out empirically. So we have kind of the wrong model, if you like, and uh, uh, and why has this been used, and why has it led to this conflict? Well, no matter how you kind of formulate this kind of uh, view of the world, uh, you get that this time preference rate that is in effect is determining uh, how current versus future generations are being valued. And then, of course, if there are more regions, then you have to have preferences over. Then we get into the issue of how people in different regions are being valued relative to people in your own region. The whole thing really starts out with uh, something that makes no fundamental economic sense, either theoretically or in terms of the reality of the empirical reality of what we know. So, and the other big thing is that it doesn't provide really an explanation of this negative externality. Why do we have climate change happening if we're assuming that somebody's there to take care of everybody and has complete control, and that's ridiculous, or that everybody's altruistic towards everybody in their lineage, even if they didn't intermarry, they would all get together and say, well, we all care about everybody in the future, so let's all get together and elect somebody who actually is going to put on a carbon tax. But we don't see that happening. We don't see that kind of voting happening. So what is the reality of the cause for climate change? It's that we have generations that are coexisting, what we economists call overlapping generations, who really don't care about each other. They care about themselves. They're selfish. And that's really where externalities arise. The externalities don't come from people that care about each other. They come from people, when we're talking about negative externalities, they come from people who don't care about each other. And the way you deal with an externality is that you, I think Raleigh's landed right here to say hi to everybody. The way you deal with an externality is that you try and produce, you don't try and produce, you do produce a solution in which everyone benefits from fixing the externality. So, I mean, just to give you kind of a simple example, suppose I have a laundry and right next door there's a factory that's polluting, that's, sending out a lot of smoke, and my laundry is producing gray sheets. When I, wash the sheets, they're becoming soiled. So I would want to make a deal with the factory next door, right? Say, look, let's make a deal where you'll maybe operate at night, or I'll operate at night, and you won't operate at night, and therefore we can both produce our products without interfering with each other. And then the factory owner, who might have the right to pollute, would say, fine, we'll make that deal, but you have to pay me X. And there is an X that I would pay, which would actually make me better off on balance and the factory owner better off on balance. And that's the solution, where you get the right, you resolve the externality, but you also have side payments that leave everybody better off. And that's the solution that we can implement in the context of climate change, because we have different generations who can compensate each other in a manner which I'll explain in a moment, so that all generations and also all generations and all regions benefit from fixing the climate problem. So that's this kind of standard economic approach to externalities. Figure out how you can produce what's called a Pareto improvement. And this goes back to Vilfredo Pareto, the Italian economist. I think he worked in the UK, and brilliant. No, he was at the University of Lausanne, sorry, in Switzerland, and from Italy. He's an Italian economist and came up with a brilliant way for us economists to think about externalities and how to fix them. And that's over 100. That's work that's over 100 years old, which apparently was just ignored by the early climate economists and by almost everyone who's worked on climate change in the area of economics. Not everybody, but almost everybody has kind of followed the same tradition that Nordhaus set either directly or indirectly. Now, why have they done that? Well, the reason is that if you want to build a model that's actually realistic, where different generations are overlapping and they don't care about each other, which gives you the explanation for why they are emitting carbon, because they don't care about other generations who are now alive, let alone generations who aren't yet born. That's exactly the explanation for why we have this problem. It's selfishness. So to write down that kind of a model, if you want to write down those equations and then solve those on a computer, you have to take into account a lot of things. First of all, you want to make it a global model. So you want to have at least, think about different regions of the world. Maybe you can't deal with all the 200 or so separate countries, but maybe you can smush countries together into large regions. So you could treat like Russia as one region and the US as one region, China as a region, but maybe sub-Saharan Africa is another region. The Middle East could be another region. Europe is a region. And I'm describing regions that are the ones that we've defined, my co-authors and I, in the work that we've done that I'm going to tell you about shortly. So you have to, you have to kind of design a model in which there are overlapping generations to make it realistic. You have to have people having kids. You have to have, therefore, at any point in time, people have children, and then they're going to have children at different ages. And then you have to take into account projections of fertility by age. UN is providing us this, and we can put those projections together by region. We also have UN projections of mortality by age, and you can aggregate those across the countries in a region to get a regional mortality rate by age. And that those rates are changing through time. You also have net immigration occurring at different ages in different regions. All that complication has to be incorporated, because if you have more people in a region, you're going to have more carbon emission, right? China is on the path to have a reduction in its population by the end of the century of 400 million people. That's more than the entire US population, which is now about 340 million people. So just over the next 80 years or so, China is going to decline in terms of its population size by as many Americans as now exist. So you want to take all that into account. You also want to take into account productivity growth, the fact that China's living standard is catching up because they're becoming, right now, the typical wage or the average wage in China is roughly about a quarter of what it is in the US. But through time, China's been catching up, and we would expect over the next 25, 30, 40 years, China's level of productivity will be the same as ours, that we will, because they are highly productive. They've got this history over the last quarter of a century of catching up. India is catching up at a slower rate. Other regions aren't necessarily catching up, but you want to incorporate productivity growth by region. You also want to incorporate fiscal policy by region. So you want to do a lot of homework here. You want to do a lot of work, a lot of modeling. And the model that we put together, my co-authors here are Simon Scheidegger. He's a professor of economics at where else but the University of Lausanne, where Wilfredo Pareto came from. And then we have Felix Kubler, who's a professor of finance at the University of Zurich. And we have Andrei Polbin, who's a economist at the Central Bank of Russia, and also he's associated with the Gaidar Institute that was set up by Yegor Gaidar. And I could not have three better co-authors. I love each of these guys. One's more brilliant than the next, and I've just loved working with them. We've written three papers. I'm going to tell you about the most recent one of the three that has these 18 regions, has people living as adults from age 20 to age 100, but they can die with a probability. And when they do die, they leave their wealth that they haven't consumed to their kids. So we have bequests. So, and they also take care of their kids until the kids have become 20, and then the kids enter the workforce. So there are, in this model, 3 million equations, and the model gets solved over about 3,000 years. Why does it take that long to solve for how the world economy evolves? Well, carbon in the atmosphere depreciates, but it depreciates at a very slow rate. So in these kinds of models, you need to know where the economy is going to end up in order to figure out where it's going. And that helps you kind of pin down the transition path. And what you really care about is the first few hundred years to see where things are going to be. That's our main focus. But to really, solve this very high order nonlinear differential difference equation, there's no mathematical formula for that. You have to basically solve it with a method of trial and error. You kind of guess where things are going to go, and then you use those guesses to update your values and your equations. What you're trying to find is a solution for these 3 million equations that are all fully consistent and highly accurate in the sense that they're between one set of guesses and the next, you're getting exactly the same answer to many, many decimal places. So that's not a minor task, putting together that size model. And it took us many years. And it was building on work that I started doing together with an economist named Alan Auerbach back around 1979, when I was just heading to Yale University. So when I got to Yale University, I met Bill Nordhaus. I was there for several years before I came to Boston University. And I showed Bill, in a seminar, this large-scale overlapping generations modeling and how it could be solved. And I think it must have been, Bill had his other methodology, which was much simpler to solve, and you didn't have to build so much into your programming. You didn't have to do so much programming. You didn't have to collect so much data. It's much easier to just have one God, in effect, in charge of everything. It's like, just one household rather than 80 different adult households, representative households, who have different asset levels when you first see them and when you start the economy out. So much more complicated calculation, and also harder to solve on the computer. You need to do it with the right technique. So that's the way things evolved. It turned out to be more convenient for economists to look for their keys under the streetlight than it was to do their homework, I would say, correctly, and then come up with an answer that was consistent with the economics of externalities that was, at this point, basically 80, 90-year-old, had been developed for a very long time, to the point where everybody knew about that research about how to solve externality problems. So let me now show you what we have found in our research, in our most recent study. And let me just say, take a moment here to say that I've been presuming in talking with you that everybody listening believes that climate change is real. And I know that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily believe that in our country. There's been surveys, and many people listening may have that view that there's just not enough evidence to believe in climate change, or to believe that climate change is being caused by human beings. They might think that the climate is changing. It's hard not to think the climate is changing when you spend a winter in New England like we just had, where there basically was no snow. And that was true, in the ski areas in Vermont and other parts There wasn't a whole lot of snow. It was pretty much a disaster for that industry. But uh, but you can still believe certainly whatever you want to believe about what's causing climate change, or even believe it's not happening. But even if you have that perspective, I think it's worth seeing what those who think, what we would do if you did believe that it was for real. What's the solution? What should Greta have told the members of the UN there when she went to talk to them? Uh, what she should have said is, after yelling at them, she should have said, "Let's cut a deal. Let's figure out a way in which we can take the gains from carbon mitigation, from imposing, or sorry, all adopting a carbon tax, a uniform carbon tax that every country in the world, every region would adopt, and that carbon tax would grow by about 1.5% in real dollars through time. It would start out about $100 at about $100 per ton of oil, ton of carbon, and grow at around 1.5% a year. That's the optimal solution. And we're going to share the gains from that. And how do you share the gains? What could Greta have proposed in this respect? Well, she could have said, do this. Put on a carbon tax, but cut your other taxes by enough so that the people that are paying more at the gas pump for gasoline, and more for heating oil, and more for natural gas to cook with or to heat with, then on balance are better off. So basically cut other taxes and run deficits. In every region of the world, current generation should put on a carbon tax, but cut other taxes so that on balance they run deficits, and then let them roll over those deficits through time and leave future generations, my generation, younger generations, and future generations to pay the interest and principal on those deficits. So on the one hand, we're going to be worse off because you're going to leave us this bigger tax bill. On the other hand, we're going to be better off because we're going to have a far better climate, because you will have reduced your production of carbon, your emissions of carbon in this process of imposing a carbon tax. So that's really an illustration of one of the mechanisms by which one can produce a win-win. Okay, current generations are better off, future generations are better off. We have less carbon emissions. And then now you raise the question about, what about other regions? What about regions that are really going to be hit by climate change? And India is an example of probably the region that's most vulnerable to carbon change. Their future GDP might be 40% lower, according to our analysis, if we don't up our game with respect to reducing emissions. So how do you ensure that they're not worse off as a result of this policy? Well, the idea here is to produce a win-win. And that means that everybody in the world who's currently alive and everybody who's coming in the future gains from fixing this problem. And how does that happen? Well, that happens through transfers from winning regions to losing regions. So if the US, for example, is a winning region, it would make transfer payments to losing regions, could be India or other regions. And this entire process of transferring across generations and across regions could be administered by an international agency like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So our paper on this doesn't, depend on exactly how this thing would function exactly, who actually would administer it. It just, the important thing is what's happening here, what the mechanism is to make everybody better off. And now let me show you some slides from, I'm going to go and share my screen and show you some slides from from our study that I was mentioning, and you probably can now see my screen. So just move this guy over here and pull this guy up here. So this is a presentation that we presented of our paper at the San Francisco Fed. And it's going to give you a quick idea about how economists go about doing modeling of this kind of a problem. And what you see here is, to begin with, is let me just kind of, start at the top here. You see the co-authors, this is our paper. We got, it's called the Can Today's and Tomorrow's World Uniformly Gain from Carbon Taxation? So I haven't said anything about uniformly gain. I've talked about a win-win, but actually in our study here, what we do is we focus on a particular kind of win-win, one in which everybody, everywhere, through all time, has an improvement in their lifetime well-being, if you like, their lifetime consumption level, how much they get to consume every year. They get the same uniform percentage, the same, I don't have to say uniform, that's redundant, but the same identical, that's even redundant too. I'll just say the same percentage increase in consumption that they're able to experience. The gain from to everyone, everywhere, through time, is equivalent to everybody being able to consume about 4.3% more every year of their life in the circumstance where we didn't actually do any carbon policy. So relative to what we call business as usual, where you do nothing to fix the problem, the gain in welfare that we get from fixing the problem and making these side payments is about 4.3% of consumption for everybody everywhere through time, through their entire lives. So this is a AI generated ChatGPT picture of what the world might look like if we don't fix the problem. And so, it was just ChatGPT read our paper and produced this picture of our paper. And the so I'll get this thing to down here a second. So we have a model, and here's the different regions. You can see that Russia is one big region, the different colored regions. China's a region, North Africa's a region, South Africa's a region, Brazil's a region, the different regions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are one region. So that's the different regions. And the computer here doesn't want to fully cooperate. And so let me just see if I can get this thing to slide. Oops. Here we go. It's starting to work. So, okay, so you write down, you figure out your regions, and then you write down formulas for output of goods and services, and for and the output is being produced by energy and labor and capital. Capital is being, is the savings of people out of their earnings, their labor earnings, and any inheritance they get. Labor supply is part of the story here. People are, able to work more or less, and they decide what to do. And then you have, wages and interest rates, and there's also clean energy in this model, and it's got a certain price, and you have people having preferences that depend on this C term, which is their consumption, how much they get to consume between when they're first adults and they die at age 80 for sure. But then there's a probability of dying, of surviving. So this is what economists call their expected or average utility. And then you have other equations that say that total assets that people have to be allocated, invested in different things like oil reserves and gas reserves and capital and land. There's also land in here and government debt. And this is taking account. This is true for the entire world. So you have these kinds of equations, and we have model equations that govern the process of emissions, how use of oil and gas and coal impact the level of the concentration of carbon in the upper and lower atmosphere in the atmosphere and in the upper ocean and the lower ocean. And this is based on physics that Bill Nordhaus first kind of discovered as an economist how to do that modeling. But the parameterization's all been updated to make our model fully consistent with the latest climate science projections. And then once you have concentration, you go from concentration to temperature, again through mathematical relationships that physicists believe are good approximations to what's going on. And then you have formulations about how much damage to the production of output occurs because of the level of the temperature. And in our model, you can get, how much damage you get depends on, you can control the degree of damage. So we're looking at kind of, I'm going to talk to you about the worst case scenario, but what this is kind of showing is that the region's productivity is quite low when the temperature is very, very high, and it's low when the temperature is very low. But there's kind of a sweet point here, and some countries are actually going to benefit. Some regions are going to benefit from climate change in our model. Russia and Canada in particular, because they're very cold, and warming up is a good thing for them. So you have to take that into account, which we do. So our model, if you don't do anything, produces this path of global emissions. It's kind of smack dab in between what these different climate models are producing. There's different climate models out there, groups of climate scientists. So we have calibrated our model to make it kind of fit within what climate scientists feel is going to happen if we don't have any change in policy. And then you see what happens over time, the loss of GDP in different regions after about 150, 200 years, if you don't engage in any policy mitigation. What you see here is that India gets hit the worst. They've got kind of like a 40, 50% decline in their GDP and their output because the climate is so bad. If you have sky-high temperatures, people aren't going to be able to work, and you'll have flooding, you'll have other kinds of tsunamis, you'll have all manner of problems that will impact the level of output in the economy. Other regions like Russia is, they've got negative damages. In Canada, they're better off if we do nothing. So these regions actually have to get bribed in order for them to adopt a carbon tax. We want everybody to take on a carbon tax, to put on a carbon tax and increase it through time. So because once the carbon's up in the atmosphere, it mixes around. It doesn't matter if it's coming from Russia, it's going to end up in the atmosphere over South America. So that's why the carbon tax has to be uniform globally. Now, let me show you kind of the results. I want to, first of all, point out that carbon policy, if you look at the emissions under what we call business as usual, you have a lot of emissions in the US, and these are just three regions I'm looking at. in India and in China. And part of this reflects population and productivity growth. India's population is supposed to grow by about 400 million people through the end of the century. China's emissions are growing because its productivity is growing so rapidly, not because its population is growing. Its population is actually declining. The US, we also have a pretty rapid population growth. We're going to have about uh, well, we're now at about 340 million people. We're going to have about 420 million people. So we're talking about another 90 million people by the end of the century, is my recollection. So we're having an enormous growth in population due to immigration as well as natural uh, birth rates. I think those projections are a little bit lower today, post-COVID. So I'm thinking more about the pre-COVID projections. But anyway, the key point here is that here's the emissions in the black curve uh, with doing nothing. Here's the emissions when you do something, which is put on a carbon tax, and then you share the gains. You spread the wealth, so to speak, uh, so that you transfer across the different regions, and within the regions, there's transfers across the different generations through this deficit policy we talked about, or some other mechanism that's quite similar. But in the end, everybody's better off. So how much are they better off? Well, the gain is about 4.3%. You might say, well, what if you left all the gains in the worst case scenario here, about 4.3% gain, and that's in the form of, uh, consumption. Just think about this is making people better off to the tune of being able to spend 4.3% more every year of their life. So that's not a trivial welfare gain. Now, and this means India is better off by 4.3%, even though they're damaged. There's also going to be big transfers to India so that they end up on balance 4.3% better off, just like, and Russia ends up 4.3% better off. So and nobody's worse off, okay? Nobody is worse off in this story. So if Greta had suggested this and said, how many of you would be willing to vote for, put your hands up if you're willing to vote for imposing a carbon tax, global carbon tax, or equivalent policies at this rate, starting at $100, rising 1.5% a year. But we're also going to make side payments so that everybody in your country is going to be better off. Everybody now alive and everybody in the future is going to be better off by 4.3% of their consumption. Their living standards are all going to be 4.3% higher. How many people are for that? Everybody is going to gain by the same percentage. I would expect all the hands in that room would have gone up, because why would anybody not put your hand up to gain, to be better off? I mean, okay, that's the great magic here, that economics can make everybody better off by fixing a problem. You fix a problem, it's a big problem, it's a huge problem. You fix it, there's gains to be shared, and those gains are, if you didn't help anybody who's currently alive and just gave all the gains to future generations. Let's suppose that current generations were willing to do that. Say, okay, we're happy not to be made better off, but we just don't want to be made worse off. Well, then you can make everybody born from today into the future 7.7% better off. And if you okay, so there's issues here, and then there's also issues about repaying these debts. The debts that for example, that India would inherit, since India would be otherwise be so severely damaged, they would have to pay a lot in the future, their future generations, because they would benefit so much. So what if you said that very poor regions wouldn't have to pay back to other regions more than about 10% of their GDP? So in that case, a region like India, on balance, would end up about 30% better off, dramatically better off than just 4.3%. And the rest of the world would be better off still. They wouldn't be as large as 4.3%. It'd be about 4%. So let me now kind of stop sharing the slides and just kind of conclude this conversation. I hope I've conveyed something about climate economics. I've tried to convey something about where we are and why we have this dissension among the young and the old and across different regions. We just had this meeting in, I think it was in Dubai, it was COP28, I think it was Dubai, where the delegates to this global climate conference said we need to have compensation. We need to have certain regions compensate other regions. Well, we've got a paper that actually, calculates exactly what the compensation should be. Now, is it the best model we could produce? No, we're hoping to get funding to produce an even more highly detailed model with more, not 3 million equations, but probably 30 million equations or more, maybe it'd be 100 million equations. We have the ability these days to make calculations that have lots and lots of equations and to double check that everything's working to many, many decimal places, all simultaneously. That's the beauty of modern economic computation. And yes, it requires a lot of work and effort, but that's what you're supposed to do if you want to do your job. You can't just say, let's pretend we have this world that doesn't exist, and then say, well, here's the answer, and then everybody starts arguing over, well, you made the wrong assumptions about your God. So I've told you about that. I've told you about, showed you that you actually can get to the right answer, showed you that the answer can be one in which there is a global win-win. And I want to say one other thing to climate doubters or climate deniers or people that think that maybe all this is just kind of left-wing propaganda or whatever, and it's not connected to reality. And you'd have to go to the NASA website and see what they think. I think they're pretty independent, trustworthy organization. Maybe don't believe that, but certainly NASA has a pretty significant discussion of climate change, and they have a pretty good perspective from their satellites to and observatories to see what's going on in the world. And they certainly are strong believers in climate change. But let's suppose you just don't believe it at all. You don't think it's going to happen. Okay, but then you surely have to admit that you might be wrong, right? You have to realize that there's a decent chance that you've got it wrong and that your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids are potentially going to suffer because you got it wrong and everybody who thinks like you got it wrong. Maybe you think that there's an equal chance that you got it, you're getting it wrong or that you're getting it right. And that actually the climate change is going to be, could actually be going the opposite direction. We could have climate improvement, not climate damages in the future. So suppose you believe that. Well, would you then think that the optimal thing to do is to do nothing? Well, economics says that's not the optimal thing to do, because by leaving the risk of climate damages for our kids to absorb, to experience, we're imposing an externality. Now, it's not an externality I've been talking about. The externality I've been talking about is kind of a for sure thing, because we've assumed, we've ignored any uncertainty about climate damages or the extent to which emissions impact temperature and the extent to which temperature produces damages. We've ignored that uncertainty. We haven't modeled that, although that's something we haven't modeled that in this paper. But in one of the other three papers, Simon and Andre and Felix and I modeled carbon risk. And we've included all the different types of carbon, the main types of carbon risk, the main types of uncertainty about this whole process. And what we showed in that paper, and if you go to kotlikoff.net and you click on articles and you put in the word carbon uh, uh, or climate in the search bar under articles, you'll come up with these three papers. And one is called Carbon Risk Taxation. And what that paper does is it assumes that there's no carbon climate change on average, and therefore no climate damage on average. So we're kind of taking the assumption of climate deniers or doubters, climate change doubters, and we're saying let's take that seriously, but let's also take seriously the fact that we don't know for sure that they're right, and they don't know for sure that they're right, and therefore there's risk. Now, the thing about risk is that people don't like risk, and our kids don't like risk, and our future kids will not like risk. So imposing risk on somebody is imposing an externality. Let me give you an example. Suppose I force you to flip a coin, uh, heads or tails, and if it's heads, you owe me $10,000, and if it's tails, I pay you $10,000. Now, if I force you to take on that bet, you're going to be worse off. Indeed, you would pay probably a significant amount of money not to be exposed to that bet. That shows you right there that risk is a problem. We try and prevent risk by buying, or deal with risk by buying life insurance, car insurance, health insurance, homeowners insurance. We do all that because we are afraid of risk for good reason. We are risk averse. We care more about the downside. We're more worried about the downside than we're kind of keen on getting the upside. That's basic physiology. I'm more worried about starving than I am about being in a position where I'm overeating. Okay, so what this paper shows on carbon risk taxation is that the size of the carbon tax would actually be higher in that context. If you just concern yourself with the risk, that there's an argument for $100 or higher carbon tax just because of the risk. So another way to say this is that if we add risk to the model I was just showing you, the optimal carbon tax would not start at $100 and rise 1.5%, but it would start probably at $200 and rise at 1.5%. So imposing risk on people is a real externality, and it's one that they're willing to pay to avoid. So here again, even with risk, you can engage in policy that produces win-win solutions. And that's what we show in our carbon risk taxation paper, that we can make everybody better off, including current generations, by putting on a carbon tax, but also redistributing side payments, leaving everybody better off. So that's your Economics Matters discussion for the day. I hope I didn't bore everybody to death. I hope at least Riley entertained people. I'll be doing this periodically to tell you about economics, because this is what I'm an economics professor, I'm a teacher. This is what I kind of live for. And I hope you guys will tune in. But we're also going to have lots of great guests, as we have had in the past. It's been about a year or so since I've started the podcast. We've had all kinds of terrific guests, from poets to writers, but personal finance experts, international economists, people who write for the FT, who write books about how Lincoln financed the Civil War. Fantastic set of podcasts at larrykotlikoff.substack.com. Please stick with me. Please tell everybody you know about that website. Everybody can join. If you want to get a lifetime free subscription, just email me at kotlikoff@gmail.com, my last name at gmail.com. Happy to give anybody, you, all your friends, your coworkers, lifetime free subscription to this podcast, and also to the blogs, the newsletter that I send out once or twice or three times a week. So thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.